Mark Andrew Holacek. I am Dave Dietrich. I am
And he
filling
doesn't
in.
look anything like Donna Vitek, does he? Right? He's not as beautiful as Donna, but then again, I don't drink Bud Light, so what do I know? Maybe some Bud
Neither
Light.
do I.
Maybe some people might think he is, but that's neither here nor there.
I'm filling in for Donna Vitek, who is on scholarly sabbatical or hiatus for those who are wondering where she is today. Now, my background a little bit briefly. I'm a retired analyst from working for several decades. I spent after that about 5 years as a part-time adjunct instructor, and then I moved on to retirement. And in my retirement years, I've been working as a docent at a Thomas Jefferson historical site, as well as doing some writing regarding Thomas Jefferson. So I guess in that context, you could argue I'm kind of an amateur published historian. Now, Mark, he holds a PhD in history and philosophy. He's taught at the University of Pittsburgh, at the University of Michigan, Rutgers University at Camden, and Ohio University. He has written over 26 books on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. The latest one is going to be the 26th one. And I think that's out already, is it not, Mark?
No, it's coming out. The 25th and 26th. One is the complete correspondence with critical commentary on the letters of Jefferson Maria Cosway, and the other is the Disease of Liberty, which is strangely enough dedicated to you, if you don't remember. Yeah, it's talking about Jefferson's views on equality and liberty, and it's a strange book. It's a needed book in some sense, because even though I wrote a book on Jefferson's political philosophy, I keep coming back to his obsession with liberty, and it seems to me I can't think of a person on the globe at the time who's perhaps more obsessed with liberty. Years later, maybe John Stuart Mill, you could say, but but Jefferson is so obsessed with liberty. I think he makes a thing out of it. So that's the reason for the motivation for writing that book. Yeah, 26. You're right.
Yeah, and I think probably most of the audience, if not the entire body of the audience, probably is unaware that you are the most prolific Jeffersonian scholar probably out there today. Maybe the late Dumas Malone and Merrill D. Peterson came close, but I don't think they even exceeded the number of books that you have had published.
No, neither came close, but I have the advantage of computer technology. Malone wrote 6 volumes on Jefferson's life over 4 decades. And, both of those, I'd like to be spoken of in the same breath of those two. I have tremendous respect for each. And if you want to do Thomas Jefferson today, people might think Malone's work, since it's dated in some sense, is obsolete. It's not. You can't be a Jefferson scholar without scrutating those two writers' works. They're very, very fine Jefferson scholars.
Well put, absolutely. Now, today's topic is Thomas Jefferson's unknown younger brother, Randolph Jefferson. And so Randolph was the youngest sibling that Jefferson had. He was born in 1755 and died in 1815. And we're going to be looking at his life and his possible what we know, what we don't know about his relationship with his older brother Thomas. Now, you have anything you want to add on that, Mark? Otherwise, we'll just go on to question number 1, if it's okay.
Let's just do it. Let's rock.
Okay. The first question is kind of a generic one, and that is, would you briefly summarize the life and times of Randolph Jefferson? For example, who was he and what was he like, as far as what we know?
Well, I think looking at some of your other questions, we can figure out what he was like from the letter that on which we're going to focus today. So we can say a little bit about his background. Obviously, he had the same parents as Thomas, right? Peter Jefferson was born in 1708 and dies in 1757. He dies when he is 49 years old. Now, Randolph is born 2 years after the death of Peter, right? 1759, I believe. That's not right. Hold on. He's born 1755. 2 years. He dies 2 years. Peter dies 2 years after the birth of Randolph. So Randolph was born in 1755. What that tells us is that Randolph doesn't get to know his father. Jefferson has had his father around for a number of years, and Jefferson is still a teenager when his father passes away. But he's had the benefit of fatherly guidance from his father, Peter. And Jane Jefferson Randolph was born in 1720. She dies in 1776. She's a woman of good blood. Father Peter, as we know, was a cartographer, justice of the peace, and he wore so many different hats. He was a self-made person, wound up purchasing and owning through surveying and so forth a lot of different land. He was a justice of the peace, a planter, a surveyor, or cartographer. He made the first really substantial map of Virginia. Jefferson was very proud. So that's so much for that. Now, when Peter dies, Jefferson, they divide up the land. There's a large plot of land that's going to be called the Snow Den Plantation, which Randolph will inherit because Thomas calls tract of land right off the Ravenna River that we now know as he calls Monticello, where he builds Monticello and so forth. So Thomas has his pick of the land. Each roughly gets a large tract of land, well over 2,000 acres. And Randolph will have, like I said, over 2,000 acres. He will be married twice. His first wife is Anne Lewis, right? Daughter of Colonel Charles Lewis of Buck Island, right? And Mary Randolph. And they will have 6 children: Thomas, Robert Lewis, Peter Field, Isham Randolph, James Lilburn, and Anna Scott. And he will, his wife dies rather young. He remarries in 1809 to Mitchie Ballow Pryor. She is perhaps 20 years old or something like that. She's super young, and he's in his mid-50s. So this is the fact that he goes out and marries someone so young, there are a lot of questions there. Right. And there are problems when Randolph dies with the will. There are supposedly 2 wills circulating, one that favors Mitchie. Mitchie wants all of his possessions. And what we know about Mitchie, she's very young, and Randolph came into fairly substantial financial difficulties when he married her. The intimation is that she went out and spent money pretty freely, and she wasn't very popular with Jefferson's other siblings and so forth. So no one really seems to be, from what I know, too happy with his marriage to her. So he came into, like I said, profound financial difficulties when he married her. But he has a large tract of land on the off the Fluvanna River, 20 miles, just almost 20 miles directly south of Monticello. So there are no direct routes there. Travel to Monticello would take a substantial portion of the day, without question. But, as you noted, there are how many letters between the two that we know of?
Not many. 15 from one, 17 to the other from the other.
Yeah, I think Jefferson writes 17.
Yeah.
There's 32. He writes 17, and Randolph writes 15. And
now, with one possibility there, of course, we have to acknowledge, and that's of the known extant letters. We don't know if there were others that we just don't have anymore. We just don't know, but at least that many, right?
Yeah,
and they're not in the hundreds, they're not in the thousands.
No, there's no reason to believe that the correspondence is substantial. One of the reasons for that, obviously, is that they're 20 miles from each other, which would be for us today, thinking in automotive terms, maybe about 100 miles or something. I don't know. I don't know how you equate it, but imagine one brother living 100 miles today. If you had to get in your car, nah, that's not even quite right. It'd be longer than that. But it's like I said, it would take a substantial amount of the day to travel. There was a direct road right up to Monticello and so forth. So it'd be an anfractuous, a contortuplicate. I don't know what those words mean either, but it'd be this kind of path trying to get there. So, I mean, that's a little bit of background on who he was, what his plantation was like. And I should add, he was a relatively successful planter, right?
I wonder if he had the formal schooling that Thomas had early on in his life. I'm not talking about William and Mary. I'm talking about having private tutors and going off to boarding schools and things like that to get a good foundational education in the classics and languages and so forth, classical languages. We don't know a whole lot about Randolph and whether or not he was exposed to any of that sort of thing, do we?
Yeah, we do. He did get tutoring as a young man. There's no question of that. So he had the same educational path that Thomas had. And he wound up going to William and Mary for a bit over a year. Thomas was there for 2 years. I'm going to do my own, but there's this collection here, the Thomas Jefferson and his unknown brother Randolph. This is a collection, almost a complete collection, I think, of the letters. And well, we're looking at a letter that Thomas wrote, but if you look at, let me find a letter that Randolph writes here. And I got markups, unfortunately. You notice Thomas always signs his letters. I'll try to bring this up to the screen. Thomas always signs his letters here at the bottom. You can see, and you right there at the bottom, you see the TH and then the colon. Randolph mimics that. He writes RH with the colon, Randolph Jefferson. And so what that suggests to me, Thomas makes sense because you have TH, the first two letters of Thomas, but Randolph, why wouldn't he do RA when he does RH? There is an H at the last letter, clearly in some sense trying to mimic his brother. Now that said, he has the same educational path. We're not going to talk about Randolph's letters. If you read his letters, there are misspellings aplenty, grammatical errors and grammatical inconsistencies, and infelicities. By infelicities, I just means not being able to put things together in the right way, in a happy way. His writing is extraordinarily terrible. And Thomas was meticulous when he crafted letters, right, to make sure that his sentences were grammatically correct and sound. And of course, he had his own rhetorical flair for writing. Randolph seems to care no wise, doesn't care at all for how he expresses himself, at least in his letters to his brother. They sign off affectionately, yours affectionately, right? That I am dear brother and so forth. It's always interesting to study small things like that when you look at the language, yours most affectionately, I am most affectionately. So the word affectionately occurs more often than any affectionate salutations. An affectionate, looking at it one way, it's not entirely a warm, that warm of a term, right? I mean, it's warm clearly, but you might think you'd say dear brother or dearest brother. Yeah, so they had the same educational path. There's no reason to think that Randolph got much out of it.
Well, can we talk more about that relationship between Thomas and his younger brother? Is there anything else we can say, even if it's on the borderline of conjecture?
Well, when you write history, as you and I agree on this, is that when you deal with conjecture, you say this is conjecture. And I do that all the time when I write. When I finished my correspondence, my commentary on Thomas Jefferson, Maria Causeway, I talk about the likely affection, the fact that why Jefferson loves Maria Causeway undeniably early on. I think later in life, Maria comes to love Thomas in a different way. And I'm giving a little bit of a side here, but the idea is that I express that as being probable or conjectural because there's nothing in the letters that there's evidence in the letters, but nothing in the letters that directly supports that. So if we look at the letter that we're looking at today, January 11th, 1787, he starts off by saying, first sentence, and you and I both marveled at this. The first sentence is, the occurrences of this part of the globe are of such a nature to interest you so little that I've never made them the subject of a letter to you. Now, this is 1789. He's in France. And what's going on in France?
The beginnings of the French Revolution.
Everything's going on. I mean, the U.S., we've got the Constitution just, ratified and so forth. Jefferson gets a copy of the Constitution. We have a new president about to take office. The American Revolution has wrapped up, and Jefferson, as you and I talked before this, he's hobnobbing with some of the largest minds in all of the world, right?
Exactly.
And he starts off, Randolph, everything that's going on here, I don't talk about to you because I picked this letter because of that.
Yeah.
Right. Then he goes, secondly, another discouragement has been the distance in time a letter would be on its way. He's not talking about from Monticello, he's talking about from France. What does he mean by that? Because he certainly doesn't shy away from writing other people in America while he's minister plenipotentiary in France, right? Exactly. So it's just the distance in time. And I just think that's sort of insincere on Thomas's part because he does write a multiplicity of letters to other people on the other side, on the American side of the pond, as it's affectionately called, the pond. It's a pretty large pond. And, so I don't even know why he includes that. It's sort of like, to write a letter, it would take a long time to get to you. And I think the first sentence says it all. If I wrote a letter to you, you don't care. You don't care about what's going on here. So what's the point of me writing you? Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just, it boggles the mind. I mean, the French Revolution, exposure to the philosophes and other thinkers of the time, or even ones that had been deceased, but their intellectual descendants were around. Then you have the science, like, for example, the Montgolfier brothers, air balloons and things like that. The beautiful neoclassical architecture. You could go on and on and on. The arts, the music, the so forth and so on. Yet he doesn't say a thing about any of that. I mean, that just blows your mind. And yet you could argue that the 11 January 1789 letter is the most substantial letter that those two, wrote to one another. At least,
Yeah, it's certainly. I think it's the first letter in the correspondence. Jefferson's first letter. I think it's the first letter overall, and it says it speaks volumes. Oh. Right? There's so much going on in the world, and I think it tells you everything about the relationship between the two. In anticipation of your third question, this might be answering your third question, which I have before me. But Randolph doesn't have an interest. I mean, look, if you talk about neoclassical Palladian architecture or something like that, Jefferson's around some of these extraordinary buildings. He doesn't talk about the Gothic designs of the churches. Not very interested in them. Jefferson, strangely enough, finds churches interesting just to go up to the high point because they're on the high parts of the city. You can go and scope out the city, but talk about the neoclassical architecture or the classical architecture that is there. And why would I want, imagine you know nothing about architecture and I'm in love with architecture, so I'm going to talk about it to you and sort of like, you know, you shrug your shoulders and say, huh, well, fine, cool. I don't really give a damn. I don't understand what you're talking about. So I think this letter, I picked it because it tells you everything. There is no relationship really. It's a brotherly relationship. The bound, and I'll repeat this later, but the bounds of affection are more familial, and the duty, the deontology here, the role of duty comes in insofar, well, he is my brother, but I don't have a damn thing in common with him. And you know, if I'm excited about neoclassical architecture, I'm gonna talk to someone or write a letter to someone who's also excited about it. That's that.
Well, taking that a step further in terms of the next question, and we've hit upon a lot of this, and that is what does this epistolary relationship between Thomas and Randolph say about their relationship? How about also, can we talk a little bit more about what that might say about Randolph's understanding of, let's say, or interest, maybe intellectual interest in fine arts, culture, people, events, so forth and so on?
Well,
I mean, is he that shallow? Is he that?
Well, you know, if you go to the secondary literature, one person goes so far to say that he's mentally challenged. And that just might be the case. To some extent, it's clear that he is. He's mentally limited. And so what are you going to do? He doesn't have an interest because one answer is, and it might be the right answer, he's mentally limited simply because he doesn't have a capacity to process that information. So what do you do with someone like that? And if you look at the other letters, I know you leaf through the exchange. Generally, what are they talking about?
Pretty superficial stuff.
Yeah, and you know, here's one, Thomas, on March 2, 2013. Having been from home last fall during most of the season for saving seeds, I find on examination that my gardener has made a very scant provision. Right? He's talking about, I sent enough to put you in stock, to wit, namely early frame peas, Ledman's peas, long hedico, red hedico, gray snaps, lima beans, carrots. They talk about farming. Now, and for the most part, Randolph is, come on, come on. Here comes the dog. He's always got to get involved. Randolph is somewhat mentally challenged, I think, in my view, but he is capable to some extent of running his plantation, but probably not without the help of Thomas's advice. And from what I gather, the only time Randolph really doesn't seek out Jefferson's advice is when he marries his second wife, Mitchie, the one no one liked. He sort of ran away and just wound up being married to Mitchie at some point, this very, very young gal. And what's a 20-year-old woman? I don't know enough about Mitchie here. I haven't researched this enough yet, but what's a 20-year-old, roughly a 20-year-old woman? She might not even be that. Why is she going to be interested in a 55-year-old guy? Was he so incurably handsome and irresistible? I doubt it. He had a plantation. He had wealth. And at the time, people in Virginia and people in the South especially, they didn't think of, when they talked of wealth, what did they think of? Did they think of money?
Land.
Land. You measured wealth in the amount of land because land meant potentiality. And that's why Jefferson, as governor, they proposed in this Virginia Constitution that every landowner who doesn't have 50 acres should be given 50 acres. Because he thought in that way, right, Bud? He thought in that way people would have an equal opportunity. Jefferson believed in equality of opportunity. That way every person will have an equal opportunity to make something of himself, right? So if everybody has at least 50 acres of land, David, if you don't do anything with it, whose fault is that?
Yeah.
It's yours.
The person's.
Yeah. And, he wanted to rid of entails primogeniture and, the way a wealthy person's possessions were handed down. He really wanted to make all people, the opportunity to succeed as an individual roughly equal for all people. At least that's what he shot for. Right.
I think we've kind of answered this, but I'll introduce it again, and just to give you an opportunity to say more if you'd like, or we can move on to question number 5. But what might this suggest, these letters, the exchanges, concerning Thomas's view of Randolph's native intelligence, interests, and perhaps intellectual sophistication? I think we've kind of covered those, but is there anything else you would like to add?
And here we have to go to the other letters in the correspondence, right? Especially, the correspondence, he starts it in 1789, the year he's going to leave. And, right. And then it really picks up, after Jefferson leaves the presidency. So that's when the correspondence picks up. When Jefferson's not involved, when Jefferson's more involved with his own plantation as a planter, the correspondence picks up a little. I wouldn't say it picks up a lot, but then again, Randolph has access to Monticello anytime he wants, right? It's 20 miles, for God's sakes, and it's not an easy trip without question, but it's 20 miles. So I think, again, we just go back to the first sentence of the letter, and all the stuff that's going, and you're amazed by it, so am I. There's so much going on. And yet, okay, let's go back to this continual denigration of Thomas Jefferson, which really pisses me off. Jefferson is involved in everything, right? Gardening, architecture, all other aspects of the fine arts. He's involved in sciences and inventions, archaeology. He studies Native Americans, all sorts of different types of culture. He studies African Americans. And yet, all we could talk about is one dimension, that he was a slave owner. I don't want to get into that, but there's so much, like you said, there's so much going on in France, and Jefferson is involved in a lot of it. And he right off the bat just tells Randolph, I'm not going to mention any. He's got a limited amount of time as minister plenipotentiary, so he can spend his time crafting letters about what's going on to something who's not going to understand or care about what's going on. He doesn't waste his time, and certainly that tells you everything.
Yeah,
that tells you everything.
As you were talking, I was thinking also, particularly when you were talking about the economic aspect of land ownership and the like in the 18th century, I was thinking about Jefferson's incredible exposure to the physiocrats of France at the time, and surely he must have been profoundly influenced by them, and the idea that essentially, if I get it right, that wealth of a nation is in the form of land. And maybe that also speaks at his interest in obtaining the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, who knows? But I just think that's interesting. But yet he didn't translate any of that to a correspondence of any meaning with Randolph in terms of, hey, you need more land because that's where the wealth comes from, something like that.
Well, how much land? He's already got over 2,000 acres, 2,500 or something like that. I don't remember exactly. I think 2,290 or something. I don't remember. But, if he acquires more land, can he handle it? He's already got more land than he could probably handle. Mm-hmm. Right. And all it takes is his new wife to start spending frivolously, puts him massively into debt, really for the first time. He's managing his affairs. And, the letters indicate, that there's a large reliance on advice from his brother Thomas to manage his affairs. And Jefferson generously, another sign of his largesse, takes his time to try to help his brother with advice, with seeds, with money sometimes, even though Thomas doesn't have the money. He gives him money at times and does what he can to help his brother out as a planter. So, his generosity needs to be noted there. But Randolph's interests are exclusively with his own plantation. You see that he's sort of self-interested, or I don't want to say narcissistic, but he's sort of self-indulgent. But that's to be expected if what I'm saying is correct, and this is conjecture, that maybe he's mentally challenged. He's certainly mentally challenged to some extent. To what extent, we don't know. He's doing pretty darn good running a large plantation, presumably Jefferson helping him, having capable people around him, and honest people. But he does that with help of Thomas. And when he marries Mitchie, things start falling apart. He winds up in debt. He winds up in ill health and so forth. So probably not a good pairing for him.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of discussing that, the two of them discussing the issue of land and wealth within the context of an intellectual excursion, more than, hey, brother, you need to purchase more land. I wasn't
ain't gonna happen.
No.
Ain't gonna happen. Just can't.
No, exactly. And that's, I would argue that's, subtle evidence of their, there's something not there in that relationship that points to, as you suggested, Randolph not having the intellectual depth that Jefferson has, nor the interest.
Yeah,
it's
not there, and that's going to look. One of the things I wanted to say, and I didn't say, and something worth saying is, Thomas is a man of extraordinary intelligence, and he's got interests in, to some extent. I was schooled at the University of Pittsburgh, which is the #2 philosophy department in the country at the time. And I had the great fortune to take some classes with some professors who clearly I would say are geniuses. Really super bright people. They are very unbelievably eccentric people. They're very hard to tolerate. They go off on their divagations or their tangents at times. They're not the most organized people, but I learned at some point when I was frustrated with one professor going off on tangents that shut up and follow his tangents. You might learn something. And you do that because you've got to cut people who are of higher intelligence some slack. I believe that. And I think, so Thomas is not capable of having a relationship with his brother either, because his brother is so far from him on the level of intellect that keeps him from even loving him in the way that he'd want to love him, I'm sure. That's what I meant before. And I don't mean to be nasty to Thomas, but it's just, you're my brother. I love you because you're my brother. Yeah. But gosh, I wish I could talk to you like I can talk to John Adams. Exactly. I wouldn't have to get, Madison and Monroe and other people to move close to me so I could have intelligent society if my brother were. But what are you going to do?
We have one final question, and this one gives you, I think, a lot of latitude on whatever you want to say. What does this correspondence, and not largely the 11 January writing, but also the whole corpus of their correspondences, what does this correspondence tell us about Thomas Jefferson's view on the proper balance between service to the nation, the obligations that come with that, and maintenance of familial relationships and responsibilities?
I thought about this question. I read it. You gave me these in advance, and I thought about this. Jefferson always says, and he says it in the letter to Randolph, right? Let's go back to the letter. Scroll right all the way up. He says, I have not the less continued to entertain for you the same sincere affection, the same wishes for your health, and that of your family, so forth. The very short period of my life, which I have passed unconnected with public business, suffice to convince me it's the happiest of all situations, and that no society is so precious as that of one's family. Jefferson iterates and reiterates that sentiment, iterate, just to repeat it, reiterates to re-repeat it. He says that in so many letters, and I always take him at his word unless there's a reason. And I want to change my tune on that a little bit. Jefferson really believes there's nothing greater than your family. There's no question he believes that. But whenever there's an opportunity to escape his sort of familial duties, he does so. As soon as he gets there, does he get involved with his plantation? No. Gives that to his grandson because he can't realize he's not good at that. He starts doing University of Virginia, starts looking for an Institute of Higher Education, morphs in the University of Virginia. And the answer is to this question, we're bound about 3 minutes here, so I'll try to be brief. The answer to the question is simply, again, Jefferson's a man of high discernment, super high intelligence. And he can't, so I'm changing my tune from what I said in earlier. He can't just focus on family and his plantation. It's too narrow for him. He's got gifts that other people don't have. He has to get involved in large. Aristotle says this in his Nicomachean Ethics. He said, the man with megalopsokia, the man with great abilities, man of great moral excellence. He says, Aristotle says, the person might sit around and do nothing, right, for years because he is of great ability. He waits for a task that is suited to his talents. And that sounds arrogant, but it's true. You don't have an Alexander the Great just sitting around, involving himself in lesser tasks. I don't mean that he's great because he's a conqueror and stuff, but people of high talents need to involve themselves with high tasks. That's what Thomas says. So my answer to that is that Jefferson simply has to be involved with higher tasks. There has to be a challenge for his intellect. He gets bored.
That makes sense. Wow. I wonder also if, and this is just a post thought here, if the same sort of pattern can be seen in the writings between Jefferson and his other siblings, or if there are writings, let's say to Mary or Martha or whomever, that are at a higher level of intellectual rigor than what we're certainly seeing in terms of the Jefferson's writings toward Randolph.
Yeah, his grandson, named after him, Thomas Jefferson.
Peter Carr.
Yeah, Peter Carr. Peter Carr was a man of high intelligence, involved in politics, died prior to Jefferson. Yeah, and you see that, but you see that's the letters to Peter Carr, like father to son. And you see that he recognized the Ellen Randolph, his granddaughter, who was very, very bright. Someone said quite arrogant stuff. Maybe she was, but she was very bright. He loved her dearly, I think, because she was such high intelligence. Anyways, let's leave off at that because we're under a minute. So next week, what we're going to go to is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Wales Epps, who's the father of Jefferson's grandson-in-law. Francis actually marries Jefferson, not grandson-in-law, but Francis marries Jefferson's daughter, Maria, and John is the father of Francis. And we're going to look at something familiar to you, why does Jefferson build the residence of